Welcome to the second episode of my podcast series, Narcissists After a Breakup, Understanding Narcissism. First, a fundamental point that applies to all episodes. When I speak of a narcissist or a narcissistic person, I mean people of any gender with clinically relevant narcissistic personality disorder, abbreviated to NPD. NPD differs from occasional narcissistic behaviour. We all have such elements. A narcissistic personality disorder, on the other hand, is a deeply rooted, enduring pattern that can strongly shape a relationship and thus impact the partner. However, this podcast is not a substitute for therapy. I am not a professional. What is presented here is based solely on my findings from professional literature and expert sources. This episode of my podcast series is aimed at anyone who, after a relationship with a narcissist, feels not only heartbreak, but also rifts in their self-esteem, perception, and trust. A breakup with a narcissist, and I'm referring here in particular to covert narcissists, often leaves behind more than just heartbreak. To truly heal, it's crucial to recognise and understand the toxic pattern. Clarity is needed, because only when you see through the pattern behind these dynamics can you internally decouple yourself and re-establish your self-worth. It's also important to understand that this pattern doesn't automatically end with the breakup. It can continue afterwards as an invisible cycle, for example through random contact, covert devaluation, reputational damage, or reattraction. This is precisely what this talk is about. It's designed to enable you to understand the narcissistic cycle, recognise your reality, and navigate your own healing journey. You need to examine the entire pattern, especially with covert narcissists, from the very beginning of the relationship. Because what happens after the end isn't a sudden reversal, but rather the consistent continuation of what was already established in the initial phase. Today we're talking about how narcissists can act before and after a breakup, and why their approach is so effective at first conquering you, and then, possibly even after the breakup, continuing to control you. Essentially, it almost always follows the same script. First, you're idealised, followed by devaluation. This can be followed by a breakup or discard, which means a cold, abrupt exit from the relationship, including disappearing, ignoring, and blocking. However, if you're already in the process of internally detaching yourself from the narcissist or withdrawing from their influence, another well-known manoeuvre, known as hoovering, can occur even before the breakup, the deliberate sucking you back in, like with a vacuum cleaner. However, this behaviour often only emerges after the breakup, for example through remorseful messages, big promises and sudden closeness. And in the end, everything can start all over again if you accept it. It's not about love in the mature sense, but about establishing emotional control while simultaneously escaping responsibility. When you recognise this sequence, you gain distance, clarity and freedom of action. Let's take a closer look at the individual phases in this cycle. The fluctuating reinforcement brought on by the initial phases of idealization and belittling, psychologically known as intermittent reinforcement, keeps you in a loop as you try harder to regain that initial closeness. The result is that your self-esteem shrinks more and more, inner turmoil increases, and you suddenly apologise for things that don't require apology, just to restore peace. At this point, at the latest, the gaslighting phase comes to the fore. Gaslighting is a form of psychological manipulation in which your perception is deliberately unsettled by the narcissist. Hurtful statements are later denied, feelings are dismissed as drama, and memories are relativised. The goal is to take control of reality until you rely more on the other person's interpretation of the situation than on your own. However, outwardly, the covert narcissist's facade remains friendly, helpful, and modest. This discrepancy further isolates. The environment sees the stage, not the backdrop in which the uncertainty takes place. Let's move on to the next possible phase, the breakup. If the breakup is initiated by the narcissist, it often happens through a discard, a cold-blooded break, and means abruptly disappearing, ignoring and blocking you as if you had never existed. This is rarely an emotional reaction, but usually a planned conscious act of power to reassert control. Another manoeuvre used by the narcissist is hoovering, sucking back the ex-partner like a vacuum cleaner. As soon as you stabilise, the person reappears, with messages of regret, explanations and big promises. This tactic can also surface if the narcissist themselves initiated the breakup in the manner described. It may feel like a rescue to you, but in reality it's a restart of the cycle. After a short time, the distance, taunts and gaslighting return. But why does this invisible cycle repeatedly succeed? Why do you keep going? Because of hope. The hope of returning to the beginning keeps the loop going, often long after the actual breakup. And now for the final phase that can occur after a breakup. When the narcissist realises they can't win you back because you've already completely separated from them internally and are no longer willing to continue playing the old game. At this point, the narcissist may resort to slander and malicious schemes, even physical violence, to maintain control over your life. The The sometimes traumatic after effects of this narcissistic manipulation explain why all this reverberates for so long. The mix of idealization, devaluation, and gaslighting strains your nervous system. You begin to doubt your memory, feelings, and judgment, become hypervigilant with new contacts, withdraw, or try to please everyone. Many sufferers also internalize self-recrimination. Maybe I really was too difficult, dramatic, disloyal, or whatever, and mistake their own legitimate perceptions for hypersensitivity. This behavior can be the result of trauma and does not represent a character weakness. But what specifically helps heal these potentially traumatic after effects? The first step is to name the narcissistic pattern. Idealization is followed by devaluation, separation, and then hoovering again, or perhaps even psychological or physical violence instead. Only when you recognize the cycle can you anchor your reality. Stabilize your perception through people who bear witness to your story, and, if possible, through therapeutic support. Once you've read this script and can categorize the concepts behind it, you can relinquish the role of the character and take over the direction. Unmask the intermittent reward. Unpredictable affection is a lure, not a test of love. And decouple your self-worth from external approval by tying it to internal standards, your values, reliable routines, your body's regulation, and supportive social networks. Conclusion. Healing remains impossible as long as the manipulation remains undetected, from beguiling love bombing to cruel devaluation and confusing gaslighting to seemingly loving hoovering. In the next episodes, we'll delve deeper into these terms and examine the specific manipulative actions narcissists use in each phase, especially after a breakup, to maintain control even after the relationship ends. For more episodes of this podcast series or book recommendations on other topics that might interest you, subscribe to this channel. Thank you.